Radio Free Maine presents Howard Zinn speaking on Beyond Electoral Politics Towards Social Change, a benefit for community-based radio station WMBR. October 16, 1996, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Recorded for Radio Free Maine by Roger Leisner. We now join folk singer David Robics for the last song of his set prior to the introduction of Howard Zinn.
Well, I think we're all getting things on the road here. So I'm going to finish up with the song Woody Guthrie. Another guy I'd like to see on a postage stamp, but Woody Guthrie, but also the guy he wrote this song about. It's a true story about a bank robber. I don't think it's even exaggerated to my knowledge. If you'll gather around me, people, a story I will tell of Pretty Boy Floyd, the outlaw. Oklahoma knew him well. It was in the town of Shawnee. It was Saturday afternoon. His wife beside him in his wagon. It was into town they rode. There a deputy sheriff approached him in a manner rather rude, using vulgar words of language, and his wife, she overheard. Well, Pretty Boy grabbed a lodge chain, and the deputy grabbed his gun, and in the fight that followed, he laid that deputy down. Well, there's many a starving farmer, the same old story told, how an outlaw paid their mortgage and saved their little home. Others tell you of a stranger who came to beg a meal, and underneath his napkin left $1,000 bill. It was in Oklahoma City, it was on a Christmas day. There came a whole carload of groceries with a letter that did say, well, you say that I'm an outlaw, you tell me I'm a thief. Well, here's a Christmas dinner for the families on relief. As through this world I've traveled, I've seen lots of funny men. Some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen. But as through this world you ramble, and as through this world you roam, you will never see an outlaw drive a family from their home.
Well, thank you, David Rovics. Fine topical singer. Let's give him another hand.
And now, from the No Censorship radio program on WMBR Radio, co-hosts Chuck Yu and Linda will introduce Howard Zinn.
Professor Zinn embodies the rare combination of dedication to the theory as well as the practice of social change. He fought for democracy in Europe during World War II, Army Air Corps during World War II. He went to college on the GI Bill, first at NYU and then Columbia University. At night, he worked at a warehouse, joining District 65 of the retail, wholesale, and department store workers.
Howard Zinn began teaching full-time in 1956 at Spelman College in Atlanta. He served as a chronicler, a participant, and an inspiration to the civil rights movement. His students included Julian Bond, Marion Wright Elderman, and Alice Walker. While serving as one of the 2 adult advisors to the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he wrote an oral history of the group called SNCC, the New Abolitionists. Although his academic writings were widely praised, he was eventually fired from Spelman because of his direct actions. He came to Boston University in 1964, at a critical moment in the anti-war movement. He was an active participant and wrote a popular book called Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal. He was also an active participant in more recent movements for social justice locally, nationally, and internationally. His most recent arrest occurred just last week at a garment factory in Everett, where 12 employees were fired for wanting to organize a union. Zinn joined with a group of union activists from Jobs with Justice. They met with management, and when they were ordered to leave without an agreement, they refused, and ultimately were arrested.
One of Howard Zinn's lasting contributions to academic history is the understanding that historical change comes through all of us, not just through the so-called great men. In his recent memoirs, Zinn wrote, quote, "The tiniest acts of protest in which we engage may become the invisible roots of social change." At the end of his memoirs, entitled You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, Zinn lays out in beautiful prose the plan of action that has guided his remarkable life. Quote, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory." Please welcome Howard Zinn.
Thank you for inviting me. First time I've ever been introduced by a team. A little disappointed, only two. Well, I'm very glad to do something on behalf of Pacifica Radio, alternative radio, to do it in an alternative institution. And I don't know how many of you know about alternative radio around the country, but we desperately need it. I became really aware of the importance of alternative radio during the Gulf War, when all you could get on the major networks was generals and Washington officials and charts and graphs explaining to us how the smart bombs were falling. And you had to turn to alternative radio. You had to turn to Pacifica. You had to turn to radio stations like this, WBAI in New York, KPFK in Los Angeles, KPFK in San Francisco, and to hear Noam Chomsky, just to drop his name. You have to drop his name once in every talk, or people will walk out on you. So, really, to hear sound analysis and to hear information that you don't get anywhere else during the Gulf War, that was the only place you could go to alternative radio. I hope you'll all continue to support it. And I don't know where everybody is tonight who is not here, and it's a question. Are they watching the ball game, or are they watching the debate? I can't believe that. I prefer to think they're watching the ball game. I prefer to think they're doing something important. And I want to say a little about voting and a little about the culture of voting and about the United States beyond voting. We live in a culture where we are brought up to believe in the sacredness of voting. You know, from the time we're very, very small and right up to through our adulthood, we are pressed on all sides with the enormous importance of voting. And when an election is about to come, right, you know that, everything stops. It doesn't matter what is happening anywhere else in the world. It doesn't matter how many people are dying, how many people are suffering, what wars are going on in other places in the world. The first thing on the news is, where are these presidential candidates and what are they saying? Of course, they're never saying anything important, and we don't really care where they are. But this is drummed into us. And if you go to school and you take courses in civics and history and government, again, you are told about voting and the legislative process. This isn't just true on the junior high school level, but right up through graduate school and political science. If you look at the articles that appear in the journals of political science, you'll find that voting in elections dominate. I mean, you'll find articles like I'm not making this up, the effects of Hurricane Betsy on the mayoralty election in New Orleans. No, really. I know there are those of you who think you want to know. But the purpose of all this is to impress on the American citizenry that the supreme act of citizenship is to go to the polls every 2 years, every 4 years, and to, pull that lever on the behalf of A or B, because it's never C or D. In fact, it's not really even A, and it's A and A prime. I feel I can use that language at MIT, in an atmosphere of higher mathematics. But when voting was an issue for women, that is the question of women's suffrage, there were a number of women who were discerning enough to say to other women, don't place too much credence in the right to vote. Yeah, get it. Since men have it, we may as well have it. But don't think it's that important. I remember Helen Keller as if, we were friends. And some of you may actually think we were, but I remember that reading that Helen Keller said at the time of the women's suffrage became an issue in the early part of the century. And she said, what good will voting do? The people in England have been voting for a long time. And what has it got, the working class in England? I mean, by the way, reading her was the first time I saw that, because she used that phrase, it's Tweedledum or Tweedledee. We might say Tweedledum and Tweedledummer. But in any case, she said, voting is not enough. Emma Goldman, well, you would expect this from Emma Goldman, feminist, anarchist, also wouldn't reject the right to vote. Yes, okay, vote, but don't pay too much attention to it, because she said women are not going to be liberated by the ballot box. Women are not going to achieve equality by voting. Women are going to achieve equality the way anybody can achieve equality, and that is by direct action. So there's a long tradition in the history of intelligent thought that puts voting in its proper place. I saw a bumper sticker once which said, if the gods had intended us to vote, they would have given us candidates. And once, crossing a bridge across the Charles River, I saw a little banner hanging from the bridge, and it said, if voting could change anything, it would be illegal. So now I know all this will be taken as a kind of anarchist, cynical, angry attack on voting. It is. You see. But now, let me withdraw 1 inch from that position, because every time you get too revolutionary, too excited about your position, you must withdraw 1 inch before moving ahead again. You see. If you want to vote, okay. I won't criticize you. If you want secretly, putting on dark glasses, to go into the voting booth and choose A prime over A, yes, it is better to have A prime than A sometimes. It is better to have A or B. Yes, sometimes. There are times when it's better to have one candidate or another. But what is not good is to think that will change anything important. Because that's not how social change historically comes about. Representative government is an advance on monarchy, but it has grave limitations. And even when it's very representative, even when it's truly representative, as it never has been, that is, representative government has always been a representation of the most powerful, most influential, most wealthy people in a society. It has never been a democratic representation, and still with all of that, yes, it is more democratic than monarchy. That's a very great compliment to voting, of course. But when the founding fathers, actually I don't really like to refer to them that way. I don't feel that way towards them. But it's a shorthand, you know, for those people, those 55 men, yes, who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 and drew up the Constitution. And they established, you might say, representative government. Not very representative, but quite representative. That is, you know, the president was still not elected by popular vote. The Senate was still not elected by popular vote. The Supreme Court was appointed by the president. The House of Representatives, the one branch of government, or the half of 1/3 of the branch, 1/6 of the branches of government had the possibility of elected by popular vote, but since the state legislatures set up property requirements, that wasn't very representative either. But still, yes, an advance. Notice how I pull back 1 inch all the time before a truly outrageous statement, an advance on monarchy. But from the beginning, the political divisions in the new nation were really not very deep, not very sharp. And you can tell this because you tell us in many ways, but one of the pieces of evidence for this claim is that the two presumed parties that arose out of the founding of the nation, that is what became sort of the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians, with James Madison on the side of the Jeffersonians, when it came to the Constitution, they were united. Now, there was a big division in the country, among people in the country, about whether to ratify the Constitution, and the ratification of the Constitution was by a very close vote in the three major states, that is in Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York. The Constitution was ratified by a very close vote. But both the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians, both presumably the Democratic Party and the aristocratic party, Madison and Hamilton, they both agreed we've got to have this Constitution. And they explained why. And they explained why in the Federalist Papers, those 85 articles in the New York press, which were written to persuade people to vote for the Constitution, and their explanations. They had many, of course, different arguments, but one of their chief arguments was that, and this is the argument made in Federalist Paper number 10, which Madison wrote, that this new government set up by the Constitution would be able to control the conflict between factions. By factions, he meant classes, you see, but he was not yet a Marxist, so he used the term factions. But he really meant what Marx meant, because he said that the factions were based on property, on who had property and who didn't have property. And there was a problem of conflict. And the idea of setting up a strong central government was to control the conflict between these factions. There's no problem, he said, in controlling a minority faction. The real problem was in controlling a majority faction. A majority faction. And then he explained what he meant. What was he worried about? He was worried that this majority faction would, as he put it, be in favor of a rage for paper money. Well, that may not mean anything to us today, but at that time, a rage for paper money meant that you were down on the lower levels. You were a small farmer, you were in debt, you wanted paper money to be issued. In other words, you wanted inflation. You wanted exactly what the Alan Greenspan what the Federal Reserve Board does not want, because inflation is something that's desired by people who are in debt. A rage for paper money, or an equal division of property, or, as Madison put it, any other wicked or improper object. So, now that was the kernel of the philosophy behind the establishment of the Constitution. To control the majority faction, to control those people who might have a rage for paper money, who might want to equalize property. The Constitution was set up to keep the distribution of property where it was. It was set up on behalf of slaveholders to keep slavery where it was and to keep slaveholders in control and to make sure that slaves who escaped would be brought back to their masters. And this was written immediately into the Constitution, became the basis for the fugitive slave laws after through the first half of the 19th century. Look at it another way. The Constitution established big government. Now you hear, of course, both parties have been rushing to declaim that they do not believe in big government. But of course, they are lying. I don't like to use such language about important people, but of course they believe in big government. They always have. The propertied classes, the elite, the establishment has always believed in big government from the very beginning. That's what the Constitution was set up to do, to establish a strong central government, to serve the interests of the slaveholders, to make sure the bondholders would get their bonds redeemed by a strong government. By the way, that thread of taking care of the bondholders runs steadily from the Founding Fathers down to the Federal Reserve and the Clinton administration. Take care of the bondholders. To make sure that the manufacturers would get high tariffs, to make sure that you would have a federal government strong enough to take care of the Indians, clear the land so people could move out west and take over their land. Yes, a strong central government. And the very first economic program proposed by Alexander Hamilton in the very first Congress in 1791 followed exactly along these lines. So that when Clinton says, echoing the Republicans, the era of big government is over, well, you'd have to be absolutely ignorant of history. And of course, a lot of people are, you see, to really take this seriously. We've had big government all the way through our history, but it's been big government on behalf of the wealthy and the powerful. And in the form of the protection of slavery and slave owners, the protection of property, protection of manufacturers, the protection of merchants, subsidies given, well, look at the railroads. Subsidies given to the railroads. 25 million acres of land given free to the railroads by the states in the decade of the 1850s. 100 million acres of land given free to the railroads in the 1860s. I would call that welfare. That's not little welfare. That's not $365 a month welfare. That's 100 million acres of land free welfare. You try getting an acre of land from the government. Just write to them and say, I hear that once you gave the Union Pacific a lot of land, many, many acres. I just want one. I need it. Try it. They always say this, write to your congressman, with whatever request you have. Subsidies all the way through for the corporations. Charters are giving the corporations special privileges. And that subsidization of the merchant marine, of the manufacturers, tariffs getting higher and higher and higher, to protect American manufacturers and enable American manufacturing industry to grow. All of this, right through the present, right up to the oil depletion allowance, right up to what we are now beginning to understand as corporate welfare today, right up through in World War II, the aircraft companies got enormous subsidies from the United States government. Something like 82% of their capital was supplied by the United States government. And when the war ended, well, let's put it this way. There was no 5-year limit on their welfare. No 2-year limit on their welfare. No limit on their welfare at all. Because when the war ended, they wanted more. The aircraft industry in the United States would have fallen apart if not for enormous government aid. And you could read the letters that went back and forth between Stuart Symington, the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, and the leaders of the aircraft industry, in which he assured them, don't worry, we'll take care of you. He said, in one of his letters, he said, let's not use the word subsidy. Let's use the word security. Well, maybe we should do the same thing. Poor people don't ask for welfare. They just ask for security. Maybe you'd like that word a little better. In fact, everybody, all of us, would like real security. It's all of this done, that is, all of this government on behalf of the wealthy running all through American history, and all of this with the pretense that it's being done for everybody. You know, the preamble to the Constitution, we the people of the United States, and then talks further about to promote the general welfare, among other things. But it's all the pretense is that the government, and this pretense is carried forward in our educational system and in our culture right up to today, that we're sort of one big family. We're all together. My interests and General Motors' interests are the same. And everything is handled in this way, as if, you know, we're just one big community, and as if there's no class system in this country. There's a fear of using the word class. How many times have you seen politicians accuse one another of appealing to class antagonism? Do you remember that during the 1988 campaign, if anybody can remember the 1988 campaign, I mean, it's Bush and Dukakis. Remember those names? Yeah. And the Bush accused Dukakis of appealing to class antagonism, which was a real shock to me, because I never looked upon Dukakis that way. Never thought he would do a thing like that. And in fact, he quickly rushed to deny it, you see. And here's something which to me it's a little thing, but to me it's indicative of the attitude, of the fear of mentioning class conflict, class struggle. Well, after all, you know, that Marx used those phrases like that, so you mustn't use phrases like that. I mean, would they be happier if we talked about factions we attributed to Madison? Would they happy if we talked about the rich and the poor attributed to Aristotle? Well, but class is a no-no. There was a review in the Boston Globe, about 2 years ago, of a movie called Germinal. Any of you see that? Germinal, based on a novel by Émile Zola. Don't feel bad. Don't feel bad just because two of us saw it and you didn't. Just because Radio Free Maine saw it. That's another alternative radio. They're everywhere. They call themselves Radio Free Maine, but they're never in Maine. I see them everywhere in the country. And it's not really them. They claim there's an enormous army of people working for Radio Free Maine, but it's always the same guy who shows up all over the country. But Germinal, Zola's novel was about miners and about what miners went through and about the bitter, bitter class struggle between miners and the mine owners. And the French made a movie of it, which came, and you know, those movies that come and go very quickly, you know, it's not like Naked Gun. There are movies that just swish by you before you have a chance. But it was reviewed in the Boston Globe. I didn't like it very much, you know. But at the end of the review, it was designated R. You know, they give those little designations, and then they explain, right, for R, violence, profanity, nudity, frontal nudity, side nudity, all those are. So I come to the end of the review of Germinal, and it's labeled R. I don't remember nudity in Émile Zola's novel, but you never know about the movies and what they'll do. They'll show the miners working nude in the mines. But then came the explanation. R. And this is exactly what it said. Intense depiction of suffering and class conflict. Well, so this pretense of, you know, the people at the representing all of us, the Constitution representing all of us, the elected officials representing all of us, it carries over into the description of the economic condition of the country, in which sort of vague general terms are used to describe what is happening in the country. They will use the word the economy, right? And the economy is up, the economy is down, the economy has improved, the economy has worsened. You do the same with other words like, you know, taxes may go up, taxes may go down. But it's all as if whatever happens applies equally to everybody in the country, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're busboys or maids or housewives or executives of Exxon. You see, it's the economy. If any of you have read Dickens' Hard Times, well, if you haven't, you should. But you know, Dickens was, yes, I'll use the word, class conscious. And Dickens, in the Hard Times, he has this character, this main character, this teacher, this pedant, this caricature. Well, sometimes, well, is he really a caricature? Maybe he's very naturalistic, but he's a stickler for facts, figures. He's the 19th century representation of what we have so much of today. The people who are great with charts and graphs, the McNamaras and the Bundys, the best and the brightest, the people who in the FBI and CIA, the people who brief the president and who brief congressmen, and the economists who get up on TV in the panels and explain to us what is happening and who tell us what state the economy is in. And this is Gradgrind. And he has a daughter, Louisa, who unfortunately, is going to be a little rebellious. I mean, that's what we can count on when we have people like Gradgrind, their kids. That's where the hope is. And that there's a sort of working class girl who comes into his class, I guess scholarship, who knows what, but she's in his class. He's going to educate her, and he tells her, her name is Sissy Jupe, and he says, Sissy Jupe, we have 50 millions in this country, don't we? Yes. And isn't this country prosperous? Yes. And aren't you thriving? And she stops. Says, well, yes, there are 50 millions in this country, but really I would like to know how much of it is mine? And that's a question that needs to be asked every time we're confronted with the economy and with this fact about the state of the union. And every time the headlines say, tax hike, tax lowered, and they always talk about taxes in a classless way, as if taxes affect everybody in the same way. But of course they don't. And of course the proper question to ask in all these situations is for whom? For what? And what about the system? How does the system affect the people who are working people? How does does the Dow Jones average mean a lot to the woman who is working in a factory for a few dollars an hour? Are we supposed to all exult when the Dow Jones average reaches 6,000 and the whole country is, and everybody watches television? And what is the universal fact on television every single night? Inescapable. The Dow Jones average. And I suppose it is possible that then people in the country will get the impression that their state of happiness depends on the Dow Jones average, you see. And so we all should cheer when we see the Dow Jones average go up. So say that next time you go into a restaurant and somebody's waiting on your table and say, haven't you heard? The Dow Jones average went up yesterday, The person will say, I'd like a big tip, But American history has often been treated this way, by putting big globs of names onto eras as if everybody faced the same situation in those eras. I became aware of this, much later in life than I should have. I became aware of almost everything much later in life than I should have. And I became aware at a certain point that what I had learned in school, for instance, about the 20s, the 1920s, was very deceptive, because the 1920s was presented on every level, high school, college, graduate school, the jazz age, the age of prosperity, the 20s. Everybody was dancing the Charleston. Everybody was having a great time. This is not just in old textbooks. I recently saw something on television, The American Experience. And I always tune in to things on television which are educational. I would never watch something like NYPD or watch the Cardinal Brave baseball game, but something that might be educational. So I tune in on The American Experience. And they're doing something on the Great Crash, 1929. And they talk about the 20s. And this is a quote. I know that some people, something has to be wrong with you when you sit in front of a television set with a paper and pencil. And I don't like anybody to see me doing it. And I don't like to confess doing it. But this time, no, I rushed to get a paper and pencil to write this down before I forget it. But the statement was, the road to riches was wide open to everyone in the 1920s. Really. And I did my doctoral dissertation on Fiorello LaGuardia, who was in the 1920s a congressman from East Harlem. And in the course of doing this work on LaGuardia, I read the letters that were sent to LaGuardia by the people in his district, his constituents, in the 1920s. And here in the Jazz Age, in the age where the path to riches was open to everybody, the letters to LaGuardia from the people in East Harlem were letters of desperation. My husband lost his job. My kids don't have enough to eat. They've turned off the gas. And this is not just in East Harlem. There were poorer people all over the country in this great age of prosperity, while the stock market was booming and the pre-Dow Jones average was going up. But that's what we have to, it seems to me, penetrate this fog of obfuscation in which the class issues in our society are clouded over by these words and phrases, the economy, and in which certain words, certain phrases are thrown at us again and again to elicit the proper response, like, welfare is supposed to bring a bad response, because if we don't know enough history, we don't know that welfare mostly went to the rich. And only in the 20th century, when there began, in the 30s, 60s, began to be legislation on behalf of the poor, only then did the term welfare become used in a pejorative and in an insulting way. Suddenly, it's not good. The woman who's taking care of several kids and living in one room with no windows on a few $100s a month and going out selling flowers just to earn a little money, obviously, there's something wrong with her. One of those words, one of those phrases that we are hammered with again and again to persuade us of the goodness of this thing is the market system, the free market. And you read again and again that what we need to do is let the market do what it will. And what we want to do in the world is to make sure that other countries adopt the market system, and so that they can be happy like us. I just there was this in the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, one of their regular columnists, is talking about how wonderful it is that the Russians are moving towards a free market system, and how great it is that they voted in a free and fair election for Yeltsin, who represents the free market. He's our man. There's another thing, ours. There's ours, there's we, there's that sort of plural pronoun which embraces everybody in the country. The majority of Russians voted for the candidate who promised to continue the wrenching transition to an open society with a free market. Wrenching transition is actually an accurate description. It's been very wrenching for the Russians to move to a free market. So wrenching that there are no flush toilets in most villages in the Soviet Union, but the Moscow stock market was up 150%. But he talks about Russia is in a long, long transition, lurching forward in the direction of free markets and democracy. I thought lurching was an accurate term after the election of Yeltsin. But, I mean, the history of the market system is a history of exploitation. It's a history of kids going to work at the age of 5 and 6 because the market required their services because it was profitable. I mean, that's what the market system is about. If something is profitable, it'll be done, whatever human misery it causes. And so kids of 5 and 6 will be put to work in the textile mills because their fingers are tiny enough to work the threads and the spindles. And kids will go to work in the mines, pushing the carts through the mines, because if you use kids to do that, then the mine owners will be able to build the mine tunnels narrower, and then they can save money that way. And the market system dictates, that whatever will be done to people will be done to people, and the ravages on them will not matter because the important thing is the market and the important thing is the advance of progress and technology at whatever human cost. That's the history of the market abroad. That's the history of the market here. It's the market system which has led to the impoverishment and the continued impoverishment of most of the world, and the concentration of wealth in a few countries in the world, and in those few countries, the concentration of wealth in a small part of those few countries in the world. And, if you read what's happening history of the market system is a history of exploitation. It's a history of kids going to work at the age of 5 and 6 because the market required their services because it was profitable. I mean, that's what the market system is about. If something is profitable, it'll be done, whatever human misery it causes. And so kids of 5 and 6 will be put to work in the textile mills because their fingers are tiny enough to work the threads and the spindles. And kids will go to work in the mines, pushing the carts through the mines, because if you use kids to do that, then the mine owners will be able to build the mine tunnels narrower, and then they can save money that way. And the market system dictates, that whatever will be done to people will be done to people, and the ravages on them will not matter because the important thing is the market and the important thing is the advance of progress and technology at whatever human cost. That's the history of the market abroad. That's the history of the market here. It's the market system which has led to the impoverishment and the continued impoverishment of most of the world, and the concentration of wealth in a few countries in the world, and in those few countries, the concentration of wealth in a small part of those few countries in the world. And, if you read what's happening in Mexico, if you read what's happening in Bolivia, if you read what's happening in other countries, the proud introduction of the market system is good for certain businessmen and disastrous for most of the people in the country. So we have a problem. This is why voting is insufficient, because the problem is not A or A prime Republicans or Democrats. The problem is much deeper than that. The problem is an economic and political and cultural system which has existed for a long time, something called at its Western civilization. of which, remember, Gandhi said, it's a good idea. When he was asked, what do you think of Western civilization? It's a good idea. But what's that? I knew I could depend on you, Jim. So, if things are going to change from the way they are in the world, in the United States, they're not going to change on the basis of voting. We may make incremental changes in voting, and as I said, yes, it might be better to have A or B, but to place all our effort, or most of our effort and energy into the voting system is to really put our energy into a dark and wasteful hole. Our energy should be directed to where energy has been directed whenever important changes have been made. And in the history of this country, those important changes have been made not because one president was elected over another, or one Supreme Court decision was made rather than another, or one act of Congress was passed. Those changes were made because ordinary people got together, they organized, and they protested, and they went on strike. I mean, how did the labor movement get the 8-hour day? There is no economic Bill of Rights in our Constitution. I mean, there's a political Bill of Rights, which is partially sometimes useful, but there's no economic Bill of Rights, and the 8-hour day did not come about for a lot of American workers because it was decreed by Congress. It didn't become official until the 1930s, until 1938. But long before that, in the middle of the 19th century, workers began to get the 8-hour day, moved the work day down from 12 hours to 10 hours to 8 hours, and how did they do it? They did it by direct action. They did it by organizing and taking action directly against the source of their problem. And so the 19th century and early 20th century is a history full of intense labor struggles in this country. Battles with the police and battles with the army and battles with the courts, and fighting the whole panoply of power, of political and economic power, but winning little by little victories, changes in working conditions. I mean, that's how change came about. I mean, if the American working class, or at least a part of the American working class, has achieved some modicum of improvement in their living conditions, it isn't because of the beneficence of the capitalists or the goodwill of the government, but it's because of the struggles that they went through. And of course, all the other important changes that have come about in this country have come out in the same way. And I mean, the history of black people in this country is absolutely, a perfect example of that. And black people were not emancipated by the Emancipation Proclamation, and they were not even emancipated by the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendments. And even those amendments were not passed simply because Congress and Lincoln decided they were good things to do, but because there was a great anti-slavery movement in this country. There was a great excitement in this country built up about slavery. Garrison, the abolitionist, said to somebody who wrote to him and said, "Please go slow, go easy." And Garrison said, "Sir, slavery will not be overthrown without excitement, without tremendous excitement." And the anti-slavery movement produced those amendments, and then the amendments lay on the books and were unenforced. No president, no Congress, no Supreme Court put any teeth into the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments until, again, black people in the 1950s and 1960s rose up and created a great movement in this country, convulsed the country, embarrassed it before the world, and began to bring about some changes in the condition of black people in this country. And you can follow this through in the women's movement. Again, we didn't have an ERA, we didn't have, and certainly the initiatives for whatever improvements that have been made in the condition of women, whatever changes in the consciousness of the country about sexual equality have come about not because of anything legislative, but because in the 60s and 70s, the women in this country got together, they organized all over the country, they became a force, they became impossible to ignore, and today in this country, while obviously inequality still exists in an important way, we are not where we were 30 years ago. The consciousness is, you can't ignore the issue of sexual equality anymore. And you can't ignore, with whatever racism there still is, obviously, in this country today, you can't ignore the issue of racial equality today. You can't ignore the problem of disabled people, because disabled people organized in the 1970s, and they got Congress. Congress never realized that disabled people need rights? No, they never did. Not until disabled people got together and organized and fought and those indentations we see on the sidewalks didn't exist 30 years ago. They fought for it and got it. And so, whatever new consciousness there is about the rights of gay and lesbian people, this was something unspeakable 30 years ago, unmentionable, but it's mentionable today. It's an issue today. And that's because of what people did on their own. Well, that's the clue to what we have to do today. Whoever's elected, and you can make your choice if you want. You can, as I say, go into the voting booth. Don't tell anyone, and vote for somebody you think will be somewhat better than the other. But much more important is joining an organization, getting together with other people, seeing what needs to be done, seeing what you're interested in, uniting, creating solidarity around class issues and race issues and equality and the end of the militarism of our country, the $250 billion budget. And I think it was mentioned before that there was this little action last week where at this factory in Everett, the Richmark, and they make curtains, and the workers are mostly women and immigrants from El Salvador, and they're treated the way workers have always been treated when they were helpless and when they weren't organized. And 3 minutes in the bathroom, no more, or you get docked. Take work home, and we'll pay you by the pound. It'll amount to less than $2 an hour. So they start to form a union, Unite, the union of needle workers, industrial, textile workers. Unite goes in, helps them organize. More than half of them sign cards saying they want to join a union. 10 of them are immediately fired. 50 more go out on strike. They make phone calls. People come from various parts of the community. There's a rally out in front of the plant last Tuesday. And a week ago yesterday. And John Sweeney, the head of the AFL-CIO, happens to be in town. He agrees to come. That helps. The press goes for big names. And so it gets a little coverage. 13 of us go into the plant to talk to the head of the company, Latino people from Chelsea, people from Unite, people from the various organizations, a Catholic priest. So we go in, and we won't leave when the head of the company will not come through on anything. So we're arrested for trespassing. We're arraigned the next morning, and our lawyer, I think, worries them a little because he says he's going to bring in international law. And lawyers like to do this. But in any case, a few days later, and it gets into the newspapers, although the Boston Globe puts it on the business page, as they always do with labor news, right? There's no such thing as a labor section in a newspaper, just a business section. And they put labor news, they stick labor news into a little corner of the business section, but the company surrenders. And just yesterday, they had agreed to a counting of ballots, not an official NLRB election, but an unofficial counting of support for the union, and an overwhelming majority vote for the union. The company has agreed to recognize the union even before an NLRB election. You see, they've agreed to reinstate the fired workers with back pay. And I think they're going to drop the charges against the criminals who trespassed on their property. So, it isn't often that you get an immediate victory like this. Usually you struggle and struggle and struggle, and someday, you might win or you might not. But I thought this was a good example of solidarity. That is, of union people, labor people, community people, people from different groups getting together and putting their energy into one place. It's what the IWW used to do at the turn of the century. If somebody was arrested in a town, IWW people would come from everywhere into that town, overwhelm the town, overwhelm its jails, right, until, they had to do something. So, and I was just talking yesterday to somebody who works at organizing hospital workers, and they won a victory over the Brigham and Women's. The nurses won a victory, am I right? Over at Brigham and Women's Hospital, which they won a victory because they took a strike vote, and the workers voted, the nurses voted overwhelmingly to give the big turnout, to give their bargaining committee the authority to call a strike. And very soon, negotiations, and they got a good contract that they were pleased with. So we need all over the country people, community people, labor people, people of color to get together, to support one another, on class issues, to support one another on race issues, on sexual equality, on gay issues, on all of these things, because that's the only way change will come about. And we have enough historical experience to know that if people persist, really persist, even doing the smallest of things, but if people persist, at a certain point in history, things begin to happen. So you should never get discouraged. Just keep going. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, this is Roger Leisner for Radio Free Maine, and you've been listening to Howard Zinn speaking on Beyond Electoral Politics Towards Social Change, a benefit talk given for radio station WMBR, located at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, recorded on October 16, 1996. This presentation is also available on a VHS videotape. For a copy of this tape, either audio or video, please contact Roger Leisner, Leisner, in care of Radio Free Maine, Post Office Box 2705, Augusta, Maine 04338, or call area code 207-622-6629. That is also a fax number. We now return to Howard Zinn for the question and answer period.
Earlier tonight, you spoke about the film German Now.
About
the film German Now.
Right.
You're better without the mic. Okay, it's a nice idea.
He doesn't have much experience with microphones.
In the recent interview in Rolling Stone magazine, they mentioned some books in there that you recommend.
I was wondering if you might want to take just a few minutes tonight and talk about some films that you might want to recommend. For instance, right off the top of the head to me comes like German Al, but also the great film Mockingbird by John Sayles.
Matewan.
Yes, and just would you like to share with us, as a historian, what you perceive as some great films about American film history?
I have a hunch you could do it better than me, Roger. You have films in mind. By the way, Lone Star, John Sayles' latest film, I think, is a film, very much worth seeing. Yes.
I'm curious to know what you think of Bertolucci's 1900.
Bertolucci's 1900. I'm a fan of Bertolucci, I saw 1900 like 9 years. I think I saw it in 1900. That's right. And I remember liking it very much, but don't ask me any more questions about it. I thought I became a fan of Bertolucci when I saw that first film that he made, do you remember? About fascism in Italy, The Conformist. Quite a remarkable film. Roger, you have any other film suggestions?
I just thought you might. That there might have been something that really heavily influenced you, that made you, for instance...
I was very much influenced by Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers when I was growing up. But I'll tell you about some of the films I used to show to my classes. I show them the film Burn. Any of you ever hear of the film Burn? Absolutely remarkable film. I think it's the only film Marlon Brando ever made that got no attention in the press because it was so good. Because it was a film about a slave revolt in a Portuguese colony in this hemisphere. And Marlon Brando played a sort of British imperialist who helped, for British imperial reasons, helped the slaves in their rebellion against the Portuguese. And so but it's a film in which the black rebels and play a kind of important role in the film that is almost never given such attention, where at the end of the film, when Marlon Brando gets his due, you feel very happy. Anyway, I don't know where you can get it. You'd have to go to some very esoteric video store and ask for the film Burn. I remember trying to get it for my class, it's about slavery, it's about capitalism, it's about rebellion, and basically it's about the fact that people cannot win their freedom unless they do it themselves. Because when their freedom was sort of helped along and dominated by the British army and the British diplomatic corps represented by Marlon Brando, who wanted the slaves to rebel against the Portuguese for their own British reasons, that was the doom of the rebellion. And they had to do it on their own. Anyway, I just want to tell you one more thing about that film. When I tried to get that film for my class, I found it had disappeared. I just couldn't find it anywhere. And so I got in touch with United Artists, which made the film. And I called the guy at United Artists, and I said, well, how can I get this film, Burn? He said, we've withdrawn it from circulation. I said, really? That's my usual response, my usual militant response to something terrible that is said to me, you know, like, you know, they, why? It's my second militant response. And he said, and then suddenly his voice became hysterical. And he said, because it's an obscene, dirty film. Really? And then it suddenly struck me, United Artists had just released The Last Tango in Paris, you see. And they loved that, you see, but Byrne, no. I used to show Attica, the documentary about the prison uprising in Attica, New York in 1971. It's one of those events lost to history. How many of you heard of the Attica prison? Oh, yeah, most of you did. This is a very sophisticated crowd, or a very old crowd, you see. Or both, you see. But how many of you saw the film Attica? Oh, well, a number of you saw it. It's a great film, isn't it? Powerful, powerful. I would also show Hearts and Minds, the film about the Vietnam War, which were just, you know, I wanted to knock out my students. You know, I wanted to have an impact on them that I couldn't have myself. And when I showed Hearts and Minds about what we were doing in Vietnam, I remember that the lights went up, the film was over, and the class went out very, very silently, and it was a young woman who was sitting in her seat, and she couldn't move. She was still absolutely transfixed by what she had seen on screen. So one of the wonderful things that came out of the movements of the 60s is we began to get a whole new group of documentary filmmakers. When the 60s began, we really didn't have it. There was virtually nothing in documentary films that you could show, really very little. But now we have, I used to show Harlan County, USA, which is a film about, you know, the coal strike in Harlan County made by Barbara Koppel, and it won the Academy Award for documentary films. A sign, I suppose, you know, we need hopeful signs. There are hopeful signs in our culture, and that is it became possible for a film about miners striking and their solidarity and so on. It became possible for a film like that to win the Academy Award, which meant that at least the culture had moved some distance from the blacklist of Hollywood. Anyway, I haven't seen all films. Yes. This
is about the media.
About the media.
Yeah. I guess when I was in undergrad, I was very involved in several different groups on campus, like Central American Solidarity groups, and I felt often that I just had this phobic feeling of things being really tied up, that everything was sort of, no matter what we said, everybody would think we were crazy if it wasn't reported in the New York Times, or if they didn't hear it on the news, for instance. This was about 8 years ago, and we had heard about the, cocaine coming in from the Contra stuff, and we would say this to people, and they'd just be like, you're crazy. And the same thing with, I just heard on NPR recently, somebody talking about the School of the Americas teaching torture. It's like these things we learned 8 years ago or however long ago, and we were talking about them, and then now it's big news, so people are believing it, and it's being taken seriously. But what my question is, what I would like your insight about is, when I hear reporters, these individuals, coming on the news and talking about this as if it's the first time they heard it, that's what's with integrity back then. Like, wasn't there one who needed to come out and say it, and had the power to, and that's what seems strange.
There are some reporters with integrity.
Yeah.
But it is not easy for a reporter of integrity to work in the major media, and you look what happened to reporters in Central America who reported what was happening in El Salvador. They were removed. Look at what happened to reporters who were reporting on the impending invasion of the Bay of Pigs. The word got out. People came from the White House to the New Republic. People came from the White House to the New York Times, and reporters found themselves displaced. They moved to somewhere where they could be safe. So it's yes. We've depended very often on people. While we depend a lot on alternative media, we've also depended on courageous people to inside the establishment to occasionally blow the whistle, and sometimes they did. So occasionally we'd get things, from reporters in Central America. Occasionally, we'd get something, from Vietnam. But for the most part, what happened is that the press and the media only began to run these things after they had been brought to attention by counterculture presses, by small newspapers. Look at who heard of the newspaper in California, right? The San Jose Mercury News, right? This little newspaper in California comes out with this stuff about the CIA and the drugs and so on. Sometimes it takes a while. And look at East Timor. Noam Chomsky was talking about East Timor before anybody was talking about East Timor. And very often you have to persist and persist and persist. And when enough people persist, finally it breaks into the major media. But it takes a lot of work. The My Lai massacre was not reported in the major press, but it took, Seymour Hersh, who was not working for the New York Times, but who was working with Dispatch News Service, this little radical news service out in the Pacific, to report it. And once something is out, you see, then there's a chance of it making it into the major media. So, we have to use every possible, we have to persist. It may take, as you say, it may take years. Yes?
I was wondering if you could say anything about the new party.
The new party. Yeah, I will say something about the new party, since I was bad-mouthing electoral politics. But I remember I retreat an inch and say, look, if you want to... I think it's a good idea to support the new party. The new party is an attempt to support good candidates wherever possible, with very little resources. But it's good to elect people to local office, as the new party has in a number of places in the Middle West, and to build up the idea of a third party, of an independent political force, of something outside the Republican and Democratic parties. Even if that party is not going to win the presidency, a third force, a third political party can raise issues. Nader is doing it with the Green Party in California. The new party, labor advocates, this attempt to do sort of a kind of beginnings of a labor party. I think all of those things should be welcomed. I would still say, as I did before, that electoral politics is not the main way in which things are going to be done, but we should do everything we can. And if there's a possibility of electing a good person to office here, there's sure, let's do it. Let's support the new party. Let's support the Greens. Let's support Ronnie Duggar's alliance, which is not really a political party, but an attempt to form a third force outside the mainstream. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. But yes.
What do you think, Professor Zinn, about the internet as a vehicle for social and political change?
The internet is a vehicle for. You're talking about a man enormously sophisticated in the internet. A man who has been trying to send email messages for the last 3 weeks. You see, if I had sent these letters through the mail, through what these computer fanatics call snail mail, you know, these people would have gotten my message a long time ago. But I'm persistent, as I say. I believe in persistence. No, I'm not going to send it to the regular mail and have them get it the next day. I'm going to work on my email problem, you see. And someday I'll solve it. But the internet, I think things, well, let me just say this. I think it's possible, yeah, I think it's useful. Most working class people don't have, you know, but sure, but there are a lot of people who do have, and we mustn't be too derisive about people who are prosperous enough to have computers and so on. We need everybody. And I remember that last summer when Mumi Abu Jamal was slated for execution, and I was just starting to tune in on email. I was always better at receiving than at giving. You know, and I began to get all these messages from all over the country about Mumi Abu Jamal, dispatches, you know, bulletins, this is what's happening, and spreading the word, and rallies taking place here, rallies taking place there. And I got the impression that the internet was doing a very, very good job at spreading word around the country very quickly about what was happening with Mumi Abu Jamal. And became international. I have no doubt that it played a part in publicizing what was going on, and therefore in that campaign, which was at least temporarily victorious in stopping the execution. So I think it has possibilities. Maybe not for me, but so I think I'll take one more question from the one person who's left. Yes.
Yes, having been a teacher of young people all your life.
Excuse me?
Having been a teacher of young people all your life.
Yes.
Professor, what would you say is the best way to get young people motivated to be involved in political issues? Say like what happened in the student movement in the 60s or the 70s.
The best way for young people to be motivated? Well, there's a sort of there's reading history, reading books, reading Malcolm X, reading Emma Goldman, reading Eugene Debs, reading Mother Jones, reading the history of labor struggles, reading the history of movements, reading inspiring stories, reading the socialist writings of Helen Keller. No, yes, but also, and more important perhaps, is getting young people out of the classroom and into whatever's going on in the world. And I always had my students as their term project not just write something for me, but become involved. I taught a course for many years called Law and Justice in America. I see two of my former students here, and they followed me all these years, and I would have my students get involved find some organization in the city, some movement in the city, some cause in the city, and spend a semester working with that group. Or if there was no group that was working on something they believed in, to form their own group. And that way, well, and some of them, after the semester was over, they continued working with those groups. I had students working with prisoners. I had students raising money to raise bail for prisoners in the Charles Street Jail who were in jail. They hadn't been tried, hadn't been found guilty. They were in jail only because they didn't have $50 to put up their bail. Von Bülow could stay out of jail, right? But a kid who needed $50. So, I had students working with veterans on the Agent Orange problem and putting together handbooks for tenants on the rights of tenants. So I think one of the most useful things to do with young people is actually get them involved in the struggles that are going on, even while they I mean, this when I was teaching in the South, my first teaching job, black women's college in Atlanta, Spelman College. I mean, how did my students learn? Not just by books, they learned by, getting out and sitting in, getting arrested, and at the same time, and turning to Du Bois, and turning to Franklin Frazier, and turning to black history, and turning to, and then looking at everything with new eyes. So, thank you.
Hi, this is Roger Leisner for Radio Free Maine, and you've been listening to Howard Zinn, answering questions following a presentation on Beyond Electoral Politics Towards Social Change. This presentation is also available on a VHS videotape.